Bonjour, bonsoir.
Hello, thank you for joining us. I know it's the end of the day. We're all suffering from the heat, but we're delighted to have you among us. So the subject of this session is Building on its Own Terms, Africa at a Crossroads. I'm Adrienne, I'm a journalist at the Financial Times based in Paris. I'll be your moderator for this session. And without much further ado, I'm going to introduce the panel. We have EZEKWESILI, who's the president of Human Capital Africa, who's an economist of Nigeria, who's got a wonderful reputation, and she's worked also with the World Bank. Thank you for being with us. And also we have Judicaëlle, OKEMBA, president and general manager of Pami Partners, who's specialized in the region. Thank you for being here. Then we have Karim AYNAOUI, who's the executive president of the Policy Center for the New South. Thank you for being here with us. And last but not least, Siby DIABIRA, who's the president for the Société Financière Internationale. And now I'm going to introduce our coordinator, Pierre JACQUET. You can make the proper introduction for this session. Thank you. I feel really humble because I'm glad that I'm introducing this session on Africa, and I'm just a European, so it's hard for me to feel entitled to speak about Africa. So this is why I would like to talk about biases when we talk about Africa coming from Europe. First, aggregation. What we call Africa, it's a continent that is diversified with a lot of regions. There's North Africa with 6 countries which are very different: Mauritania, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. And what we call the sub-Saharan Africa, where there are 48 countries, 20 of which are in a situation of or in conflict, or in 13 very small states that are landlocked or equivalent. 33 countries are amongst the least advanced countries. So a huge diversity that we also find on the economic level with giants like Nigeria or South Africa, and very small countries like the Comoros, or in terms of wealth, of per capita income, 17,000 euros per capita in Seychelles, and in also a high level in Central African Republic. Also, we have a disparity of resources. We have oil and gas that have a double stake because we have to manage natural resources. We know it's complicated. And we have an issue of transition without fossil fuels. And also other countries are service-driven economy like Mauritius and Rwanda, and the Ivory Coast has an economy which becomes diversified. So on the geographical point of view and economic point of view, it's difficult to talk about Africa at large. We should talk about each country individually when it is necessary. That's the first bias. The second bias is that of perspectives or perception, which is a trend in talking about Africa according to our own criteria as developed countries. That's a proelitism bias, if you want to say, like a gospel. We talk about how to help Africa to look like us, when it's not the subject matter at hand. And the topic of this reference is when we talk about Africa at a crossroads, and building on its own terms, the launching pad is healthier because we want to know the constraints and how they can build on their own terms and how they can make their own choices and not follow up on our European choices. And this seems to be, in my opinion, very important. This perception bias is twofold, actually. Because when we approach the reality of Africa from our own reality, we tend not to value positive momenta and rather talk about problems: schooling, human development, innovation. And what we see in articles is all about problems and issues. We have text on conflicts, on the way conflicts affect such and such thing, but we do not hear or read about what favors development, but it's a continent where a lot of things is happening over the last 10 years. We have an increase of life expectancy. We have improvements in education. Of course, it takes time. But when we look at the progress made in Africa, it was much faster, bearing in mind the population of Africa as opposed to what we had in Europe when we compare. So we should pay more attention to these biases that affect our reasoning and our reflection. Also, there are a lot of challenges, and we have talked about challenges already in X, and I'll mention a few of them. Poverty and insecurity that remain in existence. Today, we have 468 million Africans that are in extreme poverty, according to the World Bank. And another challenge is that of the transition towards a carbon-free economy and that is respectful of the environment while managing growth and an improvement of the per capita income, and also the societal construction where we have no lessons to give ourselves because it's a matter of an intrinsic development that goes through conflicts that are extremely painful and cruel and that last long. And I think that Africa is at the crossroads of all these transitions, and this is the case for many African countries actually. Against this backdrop, there's also demography because the Minister of the Ivory Coast has talked about the young people in Africa that are numerous and that are very vibrant, that stand for the future of Africa, and that's also a major challenge because the economy needs to follow up on this and provide jobs. One of the questions that should haunt us in Europe, modestly, is how can we help from outside processes that are fundamentally inside Africa, indigenous to Africa, so that Africa can build their future on their own terms with a permanent dilemma. Giving money that is not enough, but requiring too many prerequisites is not good. It would hamper help for environment and for development, and it will not help the Africans to gain ownership of their own future. And I'm going to give the floor afterwards. I'm going to take the floor afterwards. Thank you, Pierre. As Pierre has said earlier, we have a challenge which is almost impossible to solve because we have a diversified continent, a very large continent, but we'll do our best to try to think about some of the main issues. To start, I would like to go to Siby, because you have a prospect that is an outlook which is quite interesting in this debate. You have worked for most of your career in some emerging countries like South Africa, more recently. Now you're the manager for the Western Africa for the IFC. So the question is the following: are there significant differences in the way you approach African economies as opposed to the means that we mentioned for the European countries in the analysis, but also the vocabulary that we would use, the terms that we use? Does it change over time? What do you think? Thank you for this question. I would like to thank Pierre for these preliminary remarks because there's a lot of input which is very important. It's very important to set the scene when we talk about the African continent and when we talk about countries of Africa that we want to support with the French Development Agency, but also the International Finance Corporation of which I'm a member for many years now. There's one point that is important. I was lucky to work in South Africa, but I was also lucky to work within other contexts and in other African countries, may it be in Western Africa. I'm actually French, but also I come from Mauritania. I have Mauritanian nationality, and it's a bridge between France and Africa for this way, because this has prompted me to work in favor and for the continent because I studied and worked in France first. Another important point, and I think perception is important, because when we are on top of a cliff and we look at the other side of the mountain, we look at things differently. And this was precise, and this was actually put on the spotlight in the introduction. We don't see things in the same way. We don't use the same terms. And there's an anecdote which is quite interesting. I worked with on a renewable energy project to illustrate what was said and how we can perceive things differently. It was a project in South Africa that was launched by local partners. And when I talked about it with European partners, the first thing I was asked was whether there were lenders. Because to have credibility, it needed to actually be managed by external lenders. But there were no external lenders. And the project was managed and was initiated by local engineering teams. And for me, it was actually something striking over the years that I worked there in South Africa and within the different African countries. In terms of vocabulary, and that's very important, and over the last 2 days where I was here in Aix, when we talk about Europe, we talk about resilience, we talk about transition, we talk about adjustment. But sometimes we talk about the same subjects, and when we want to speak about our African country, we'll talk about fragility, we talk about risk. It's hard for us to use these terms that are positive. When we talk about what we do in terms of project, when we talk to the continent, we use other terms. So it's important to change the narrative, to change the storytelling. So, as was said earlier, things that are happening are manifold, and we need to find local solutions. Solutions are to be found locally, and they need to go through local partners. And as a stakeholder, as an international stakeholder, as an international body held for 185 countries, what we have to ask ourselves when we speak to governments, when we talk to companies, we need to ask them what they need to see how we can help them when we grant loans to make local projects emerge. And when we talk to European partners, that's the role of the IFC or the World Bank. And when we are in Western Africa, we need to be able to bring about a different perception on the African continent. That's a very good point. Thank you, Siby. And we'll go back to the different projects that you support with IFC. I would like to turn to Karim to talk about all these changes and all these projects that are ongoing right now. So to prepare this panel, we had a long discussion on many subjects. So you made a remark. You think that now we are about to reach a turning point. Can you mention what you're talking about and give a few examples? What is changing right now? Thank you. Hello, everyone. I think that we are in a time of introspection. We're actually brewing, thinking about who are our friends, because some family members we have fallen out with some of our family members. We are thinking about our lifestyle because it's in danger. We feel besieged, and this has been mentioned by the Minister of Finance early on. In Africa, it's actually a second stage of development. We were talking about independence during the 50s and 60s. We were talking about funding and the constraints of development, the basic infrastructures development that were actually straightforward development strategies without that needed a new impetus. So there are subjects on the construction of states in Sahel, in Morocco, on countries where per capita income is higher, or in countries where we have intermediary per capita income, or low-income countries. We are talking about going back on track. So growth strategies are rather straightforward. It's more complicated because advanced countries actually export uncertainties, paradoxically. And the European difficulties of transportation, you've heard about this over the last 3 days. There are additional complexities that feed development policy. So each country should look inside. It's not uninteresting because we tend to be like a frog sitting in boiling water. So the exogenous shock of the new world order coming from America tends to make us question the world, especially in Africa. We tend to think about what kind of world we want in a more open world, because before we were in closed loop, in fruitless discussions sometimes, in landlocked areas, and now countries have the choice. Well, we live and die by our choices, obviously, and the question needs to be well tackled. And to make a choice, we need to be reconciled with ourselves. We need to make sure that inside we are robust, and we need to have social cohesion, which is not the case in every country. It's not the case in Europe either, in the US itself as well on the interior front. But the strategic value of partnership, when I talk about the objective meaning of the word, of Africa, has changed. And countries are different in their relationship with Europe. I think that we have to look at Africa with new spectacles. Not all thinking about charity or ethics, but with whom could I do something? I'm going to give you an example. On energy, we have so many things to do together on renewable energy, on solar panels. In terms of value chains for automobile, we have 650,000 cars a year. We're working with Airbus, with planes and so on. So there are a lot of countries that are actually integrated into this value chain. And so what we ask in reality is a repoliticization of our relationships. Our relationships with Africa cannot be tantamount to technocracy in Brussels. No. The governments should take the upper hand again and give a new political aspect to their relationships. They should not have cosmetic aesthetics as to the way they have relationships with Africa. That's another kettle of fish. This is over, the development as we knew it. But it's a matter of maturity in relationship. It's an era of maturity in our relationships with the African continent in this more open context. And it's a matter of questioning ourselves in Europe, because it could have actually the feeling that it was at the end of a pathway in terms of social harmony. I think we have challenges that are quite similar. And we have a demography that is quite complementary, but we need to raise more political challenges and questions that we should think about together. So in our think tank, we try to be a public policy think tank lab, so to say. We do a lot of psychoanalysis, and that nothing is neutral, because politics have a nature, and they have a flesh and blood. And the countries represent what they are. Sometimes we can be mistaken. So when we've done things for 50 years and all of a sudden things change, well, it's not. It's like your children. You don't want to see them grow. You always think that they're babies. And you say, oh, no, they're 50 years old. You're not going to say to your child that he should brush their teeth, you know? It's the same thing. And it's very bad for us, because naturally our brain is lazy and we tend to procrastinate. So what we try to do is to try to disclose this prejudice. Thank you, Karim. Now it's time maybe to have a more pragmatic approach, something that is more adult. So when we talk about a pragmatic approach, maybe there's an economic easing maybe that we should find. There's some figures. Inflation is going down. The growth should go up in the years to come. It depends on the region, of course, and country by country. But according to the forecasts, the region should reach a growth which could be double of that of the advanced countries up to 2030. Judicaëlle, I would like to ask you, what are the opportunities? What kind of opportunities does it represent? And according to you, what do your customers want to do to to seize these opportunities looming ahead? Thank you for asking me the question. I would like to go back to the context of the subject, namely Africa at a crossroads, because there's a matter of confidence. The Africans, the governments, but also the private sector are such that people are awake and they know that there's an opportunity to seize, and that this continent offers so much because it has a young population. Yes, there's an inflation, but there are several niches that are open, that could be harnessed, where we could make business. So it is crucial for Africans to become aware of their stance or their positioning, because it is a continent which will have to make do. We can't do without them, because we've been a bit out of the system for some time. Some people try to find help and aid, but this is evolving elsewhere. So yes, there's inflation, but there's a lot of opportunities, and Africans have become aware of this. And I think there's a lot to do. And what about your customers? Do they contact you for what? Particularly now, what do they need? Do they need your outlook on which issues? Our customers contact us for our knowledge on the field, issues. And paradoxically, there are customers that are outside Africa that want to invest in energy, in water, with sustainable development issues. I'm based in Switzerland, so we have Swiss partners coming up to us to talk about transformation from waste to energy. So we need to upcycle waste that the Africans do not consider as interesting, whereas it's a gold mine. And they go to other consulting firms to try to invest in the continent. And I think it's a beautiful partnership that would be a win-win with an exchange of experience. So we have to bet on Africa and Africans, definitely. Thank you. Thank you. I would like to talk to you, Obi, to talk about Nigeria. Over the last years, there were several reforms that were implemented in the country, according to the economists, that helped to boost the growth. We saw the unemployment rate that went down since 2019, especially among the young population. So I wanted to ask you, do you agree with this analysis of economists that these reforms generated this high growth rate in the during the last quarter? Could you explain for our public what were the key reforms and the key changes that brought about these positive changes?
Especially to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. To your question, the economists, I think they missed it.
Dis-nous pourquoi.
And it's not unusual.
Okay.
There was a time when the economists looked at the continent and called it a basket case. And then it recanted for doing that. So they do miss. I've been reading The Economist because of my dad from when I was a child. So I'm a fan of The Economist, but sometimes they miss the boat. So Nigeria's growth in recent times has been in the low regions of 2 to 3%. Anyone who calls that a high growth is in the fallacy of a low expectation syndrome, which is normally the problem we have concerning Africa. People just look at Africa and sort of index it to whatever just looks a little positive. They clap for it because they need to find something to clap for. We don't want to be patronized. When you talk about building on our own terms, number one thing is stop patronizing Africa and Africans. I think that a key point that needs to be made is that for a country that has a population growth rate of almost 3%, you cannot call growing at 3% a fantastic thing. Now, are there reforms that have recently been embarked upon? Perhaps. And one of them is the reform of the pricing of petroleum in the country. That was important to be done. Unfortunately, the sequencing and the preparation for the implementation of removal of subsidies was so poorly done that it had very, consequences that were both normal and the ones that could have been envisaged and mitigated against. So you can do reforms, but do reforms in the wrong way. And so it then ends up affecting the citizens. So when you talk about the really good reforms, you have to talk about them in terms of what ultimate impact would they have, and how do you cushion the effect of those impacts? That has to be part of the reform design. The government didn't do well with that. Another aspect of the reform is, of course, pricing of the foreign exchange that narrowed the gap between the parallel market for foreign exchange and the official window. And that was important. I particularly wanted that reform to happen. It did help to bring a measure of stability to exchange rate volatility, because exchange rate volatility is bad for business. Every time that we talk about inflation and we talk about exchange rate volatility, we're essentially saying that you're eroding investor confidence, right? And you need investor confidence to attract investment. And so there are some of those elements of reforms. But more profoundly for our country is the matter of youth unemployment. It is still terrible. Youth unemployment is about 60% of unemployment. And that is horrible, because what it does is that it creates a supply pipeline for the problem that is most important and critical for us now, which is the insecurity problem. You're creating a market of those who would easily be recruited by terrorists into the business of terrorism, and that is terrible for us. So the aspect of reforms that we most need are structural reforms, reforms that make our environment an enabling environment, not just for attracting investors from France or from Europe, but actually making small businesses to have environments that are not creating many barriers and hurdles for them to grow. And there we are failing still. The cost of doing business in our country is way beyond what should be. And so if you look at the data on entrepreneurship, the African women are more entrepreneurs than anywhere in the world. But then you have to ask, at what level? The problem is that it is at a low productivity level. So imagine a situation where reforms tackle those barriers that stand in their way for productivity. If we enhanced the productivity of the African woman as an entrepreneur, it would actually help us solve a range of problems, especially when you look at the SDGs. When women are economically empowered, more than 70% of their income go to the things that matter on the SDGs. So that's so crucial. So you can do macroeconomic reforms, but you must complement them with structural reforms. And my final point is to target into Africa, because we're discussing Africa. One of the things that a lot of people are sleeping on is what the demographic structure of the world is saying to us. I mean, average age in Europe today is 44 years. 44 years. Average age in America is about 39 years. Average age in China is 39.5 years. Average age in Latin America, 33 years. Average age in India is 29 years. Average age in Africa is 18.9 years. Now, if you were sitting in a boardroom and you needed to make decisions about the future, where would you be looking at? Where would you, come on, answer me, guys. You'd be looking at Africa, So the whole idea of continuing to have people in Europe who, when they look at Africa, see a humanitarian case is a misnomer. I mean, it's like you're sleeping on the opportunity. It ought to be that when you look at Africa, you don't need to be talking about helping Africa. Help yourselves. You've got to help yourselves. Help yourselves, because if you don't look at Africa today as a business case, you're missing out big time. I rest my case.
Obi, j'avais une question de suite sur...
Obi, I had a question. I wanted to follow up on this question.
Parce que, bon, vous avez levé...
So you raised a point that I want to talk about later, but I'm going to mention it now because the demographic curve across the continent and in Nigeria is completely the opposite as in other parts of the world. How can we make this more of an advantage for Africa? How could that be taken as more of a benefit for those economies? What do we need to do?
It's a very important question you've asked, because Africa's greatest problem is governance. Governance. Poor governance is the debilitating factor that holds us back from accelerating at the speed we should accelerate. And so when you say, what's the first thing we need to address? It is poor governance. We have to address incompetence and corruption in the way that African countries are led. It's an important thing to tackle. And then we need to understand that a lot of the people who ruin Africa, not govern Africa, the ones who ruin in the place of governance are failing to understand how important it is to place human capital at the center of our economic strategy. You see a lot of the people in government, they love to talk about infrastructure. Why do they love to talk about infrastructure? I talk about infrastructure. It's an important and critical factor for growth, for economic growth. But when you see African leaders obsessed about infrastructure, it is merely because that is where they get the procurement opportunity for corruption. That's what it is. So they ignore the potent need to actually produce capable citizens through education. So for example, one of the data that keeps me awake every day is the terrible data that 9 out of every 10 children that are in school in Africa are not achieving minimum proficiency levels in literacy and numeracy. For the rest of the world, it's 6 out of every 10. In a place like India, it's 8 out of every 10. As soon as that data came out, Prime Minister Modi was so angered by it, he decided to become the champion for fixing early grade education, because it's a predictor of the quality of human capital you will ultimately produce at scale. But on our continent, that data came out, nobody behaved like they saw it. That is the poor governance part of the problem. And guess what? For me, I think that what will address it ultimately is the restiveness of the African young people. So when you talk about how do we convert this demographic advantage to what it should be to propel the growth of the future, it will not come from governments. It will come from citizens who are tired of failing. The truth is that if you want Africa to do well and to do well faster, shut down all the governments in Africa. Africans will do better without government than they do with government. That's the truth. I mean it. The governments have become the greatest barrier to the capacity of Africans. Look at our young people. Look at the talent sector. If you look at the talent sector of Africa, technology, creativity, you know, and all the other associated fashion industry, sports, you know, talent-based sectors, you see Africans are playing at the standard of the world. As soon as government is involved, it goes in the reverse. So fixing governance is so important and critical for Africa. Well, you should not be shocked that I'm making a big do of the governance issue. I'm one of the co-founders of Transparency International, the organization that works against corruption globally. And I believe that this is the biggest barrier that we must tackle. Thank you.
Est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un d'autre qui veut venir?
Is there anyone else who would like to talk about this issue of democratics? Otherwise, I'll ask Siby some questions. I've got a point about governance and education, actually. Can I speak about that? I had two comments to make. First of all, I think that good governance is not something that can be imposed from the outside and overlay on systems in Africa or elsewhere. It needs to be an endogenous movement. So the fact that we say there are governance issues doesn't help us understand how to solve these problems. Combating corruption requires the society to be strong and robust. The second point is about education. I think if we have an education supply without sufficient demand, doesn't lead to success. I can remember my experience in India. India has just been mentioned. There's a major effort in terms of education, but the problem is that the young people who graduate haven't got jobs to go to, and so they take jobs in the informal sector, which are underpaid and underskilled compared to their qualifications. They feel like they've sacrificed their lives and money, resources that they didn't have to get a qualification that's useless. And that has an influence on future demand. So I don't think we should make education opposed to infrastructure. Without infrastructure, you won't get any return on the education investment. So I think these two issues need to be tackled at the same time.
Okay.
I am sorry. We're not in a zero-sum game. We're not in a zero-sum game where we're saying it's either infrastructure or education. That's not what we're discussing. I'm simply making the point that when you are putting too much energy in infrastructure and you're not developing your human capital, that's a problematic situation you have on your hand. Number two is that you have to, I said it already, you've got to embark on reforms that open up the economy for opportunities for investment, both local and external investment. While you're doing that, you must be growing the kind of human capital that would be able to find opportunities, and if they don't find opportunities in jobs, they find opportunities in creating jobs themselves. You know, the time to do silo approach in economic management is over. We have to look at economic management as an integrated thing, and that's so important for us to acknowledge.
Merci beaucoup. Je veux aussi rentrer sur le sujet des infrastructures.
I just want to go back to the question about infrastructure. Siby, could you talk about electrification projects that you're working on? I think you're aiming to connect 300 million people who haven't got access to electricity to the electricity grid. How are you doing that? How's that working? And how are you coordinating this initiative across a number of countries? What are the challenges you're seeing? I will answer your question, but I just wanted to respond to what's been said about education, governance and infrastructure. As my co-panelist Obi has said, we need to take a holistic approach. We are not talking about one or the other. We need to address all of these issues at the same time. We're running out of time. It's an urgent situation. So in order to transform this demographic growth into an opportunity, a dividend, we need to solve all of these issues at the same time. We're going to need to develop the tools we need in order to solve these problems together. So when we talk about education, for example, education is about making sure that jobs are available for young people, high-quality jobs, local jobs for the people who are trained. So what we need to do is listen to local needs in order to answer that question. And this is tied into the question of infrastructure as well. So the World Bank Group and IFC is the private sector. The private sector provides about 90% of employment. So in the public and private sector, we've decided to take a holistic approach, an all-round approach, and the aim is to give access to 300 million people to electricity by 2030. And to do that, we've put a partnership together with the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and other multilateral lending agency. So what we're starting to do is to bring a number of states and governments together despite their failings, and we've asked them what type of reforms are necessary to ensure that the private sector can invest in those countries. It's a big project, it takes time, but now we've got more than 20 countries who came to meet us in Dar es Salaam in January. We had a follow-up meeting in London a few weeks ago in order to see how those reforms were going. In the room we had governments and the private sector, which we'd brought together, and the private sector wanted to hold the governments accountable for the reforms. They were asking about very specific projects, and we were saying what tools were necessary in terms of investment, equity investment, as lenders and funders in order to crowd in new investments. So to answer the question about infrastructure, to respond to the infrastructure issue, which will enable our young people to get jobs, because without electricity it'll be very difficult to develop these things. So we're talking about infrastructure. What infrastructure do we need? Social infrastructure, energy infrastructure. There's a whole range of subjects that we need to resolve, and we could spend a lot of time talking about governance and education, but I will let my co-panelists talk about some of these other issues. I'm sure we could spend a whole panel talking about each of these issues that have been raised just now, but we'll try and move things on a little bit more, because there's something that Karim addressed in his opening remarks, something that's very important in order for us to implement all the projects we're talking about. The issue of geopolitical uncertainty, which is exported to different parts of the world. It's affecting us in Europe and also in Africa. So, Karim, I'd be very interested to hear what you think about this. We're seeing a lot of change coming from the United States. They're changing the way they want to act in the world with a very transactional approach to diplomacy, a deal-making approach to diplomacy, which is quite hard to predict. And at the same time, we're seeing almost complete cut-off of US development aid to other parts of the world. So how should we respond to that? What opportunities does that represent for Africa at this time of change? I think it's a good thing. I think it's good news. Paradoxically, I've been in a number of meetings, and the people who were most upset about the end of development aid were people from the north, because there's a whole industry that's grown up around it. It will stop governance hiding behind a lack of development aid. It's going to be a time of accountability and empowerment. So in the total balance of payments for the countries, it's a fairly small contribution overall. We've seen media reports about what the social implications will this be, calculations of the number of people who might die. I don't think that's the right issue to look at. The first people who are responsible for their citizens are the states and the governments. That's where responsibility lies. So I think development aid, as we've known it since the 1960s, is dead in the water now. The page has turned. Europe has switched its development aid towards military spending. It's not very well accepted by the population. There are some needs in Europe that are quite similar to what is funded by development aid, things like health and education spending, and European populations want their governments to be efficient in those areas. I think it's a good thing. It's good news. The pressure that Obi was talking about having good policies, it requires the responsibility to lie in the right hands. I don't want to talk about the content of reforms, but about the mindset that is needed. All of these issues are complex. That's what I wanted to say. We're talking about addressing all the problems at the same time. Our governments, including European governments, I might say, are somewhat overwhelmed. So they've been overwhelmed by the scale of citizens' expectations on a welfare state, social protection, providing services to all citizens, security, and many other issues. It's a difficult challenge, and sometimes we underestimate how much of a challenge it is to maintain social cohesion. It's true for African countries. Obi, what you're asking is a difficult thing. Although I agree with you, these reforms are complex, and we sometimes underestimate the complexity. I think there isn't a lack of intellectual strength and human capital. We have people here in the room, there's people all around Africa, but the issue is how we can draw them together and engage them, empower them. I believe the solutions are in our countries. We're in a particular time, a time for introspection, a time for those of you who run marathons, long-distance runners, it's like what you call the second wind. Our countries need to get a second wind. We need to get out of the middle-income trap. The low-income countries need to take off. And the resources to do all of that are to be found in our African countries. One thing I'd like to say about is what we can do with Europe. One of the answers about what we can do with Europe is about drawing up new partnerships with different regions of the world. We had a round table talking about Latin America, and it's relevant to Africa too. It's going to require hard work. We're going to need a kind of aggiornamento. We've never really sat down to properly talk about things together. We need to sit down and talk together. It's not going to be national governments that do it. They haven't got the time. They're under pressure. I think that the European response to this shift in the geopolitical context has been too quick. Politicians do need to provide answers, but that we're trying to put together new projects, budgets of billions and trillions and zillions is something that worries me, actually. I'm not reassured. I'm rather worried about what's going on. What's happening is complex. We need to step back. We need to take a good think about what we're doing. Yes, politicians need short-term responses, but where are things happening? How can we organize a response within our countries? We're still managing our governments as the same way as several centuries ago, with different ministries, different departments. Is that what we need to face these challenges? And within our countries and between our countries, we need to sit down and think what we can do together with compatible brain power. I think African brains, African minds draw on their culture, their heritage, their long-term memory, and I think it is compatible with European mindsets, but maybe a bit trickier with other parts of the world. So I think that this type of meeting, this type of forum will enable us to move forward a bit better and be more efficient in solving some of these issues, both in terms of what we're doing together and what's happening inside our countries, because we're all affected the same transformations, but to different degrees. So you talked about finding different ways to work together, but I want to ask Judicaëlle a quick question. We've not got a lot of time left, but this uncertainty does present opportunities for business, but for businesses, uncertainty is not always what investors are looking for. What do your clients and partners see in today's world? Well, I would say it's up to national governments to create a climate of trust and confidence by combating corruption, as has already been said, and by setting up systems for transparency. I know that a lot of African countries, including my home country, Congo-Brazzaville, which has switched the Ministry of Finance to a totally digital-based service. So there are hardly any more money transfers that are happening in cash or with banknotes. Money is transferred digitally to the government, and that kind of reform builds trust. And when there's a climate of trust, investors are happy to put their money in because the transparency is there. That reassures investments. I come from Congo-Brazzaville, as I said, and there's also an issue around our economic zone, the CMAC zone, where it's difficult to transfer money out of the region. That's a real weakness, and that holds investment back. I think there's going to be a whole process required to resolve this, but I think we're going the right way about it. So ensuring stability when the climate is difficult can lead to successful projects. Yes, it can, indeed. I just wanted to take a few minutes to open up for questions from the floor. If you've got any questions, I'd like to ask you to be very brief, very precise in your question, but we would like to hear from you. So let's start with the gentleman at the front here. I've got a question for Karim. Karim has talked about partnerships with Europe. I'd like to mention a few figures before I talk about win-win partnerships, win-win business partnerships with Europe. In May, I was at the Africa Forum and I watched a partnership agreement being signed between a property investment firm in France, a $150 million deal. It seemed pretty significant to me. 2 weeks later, I was in China, where in an infrastructure forum, 176 projects were signed off for a value of $11 billion. A fortnight later, I was in Rwanda at the US-Africa Summit, and $2.5 billion were committed, signed off for Africa. So here's my question. Culturally, we probably have long-standing relationships with what we'd refer to as the old continent, but is the European private sector, and perhaps Siby is well placed to talk about this because she's from the IFS, is the European private sector interested in doing business with Africa? Karim first and then Siby. Very quickly, I think you have to be very operational and pragmatic and do deals with whoever you want to, whoever's ready to deal with you. There's no rules about it. I've been talking about Europe because we're here in Europe, but we can work with anyone. The world is fairly open. There'll be some pressures on the alliances, you can do with things. I think there'll be some requirement for geopolitical alignment at some stage, but we need to be very cold-blooded and transactional about it, leave the feelings to one side. This will require a certain level of political concession-making. It requires dexterity, agility, and adaptability to be able to make choices based on what you want. I think this is a time for maturity and accountability in the world. Up to 1990, there was a binary choice. You're either with the Eastern Bloc or Western Bloc, and now it's a lot more complex. Are the countries ready for this? In most cases, probably not, but some countries are, and that's why I talked about the fact that we need to rethink our relationships with the rest of the world, relationships with our partners, and what we do in our own countries. Siby. Yes, if I could perhaps add to that with respect to the private sector, I could give a few figures myself. Currently, the investments from IFC with our European partners, IFC is investing around 70 billion per year, and European partners represent 25 to 30% of that. So I think there's fairly high appetite still in key sectors such as financial sector, infrastructure. We're also increasing our staff teams in Europe because we are seeing European countries are interested in investing in African countries. The proportions may be different and they may vary from one country to another, but and yes, it is a very transactional approach. If the project is commercially viable, if the project will enable the group or the business to expand, it will invest. It's a very pragmatic approach that we see, and I think this question makes me think of a quote by a Caribbean author called Edouard Glissant, who said, we need to get out of a single way of thinking, but we need to get into a way of thinking about relationship, a relational way of thinking. That's what I think. Relationships are great. They need to be win-win. I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to leave you in just a minute to take my train. Yes, Siby's got a train to catch. Can we take perhaps one last question? The lady at the front, very, very quickly, try and be as efficient as possible. Thank you. Thank you. A very quick question for Obi about governance. Do you think that governance is not just a top-down issue? Is there a bottom-up approach to governance? What role can citizens, young people and women play? How can we engage them and mobilize them? Because they have power, how can we engage them to use their power? What mechanisms can we use? And how would you encourage this civil society to hold governments accountable? Thank you. Obi.
Exactly is what is happening. I don't know how much of developments in Kenya you have been following. That's really citizens saying, enough of poor governance. We want a different deal. And it is not outsiders that are propelling them. It is citizens saying, we want a better deal than what we're getting. And those young ones and the women they're not even troubled by the fact that government rolls out the police or military to attack them. They are determined to redefine governance. And that's the kind of support that's the kind of thing that Europeans need to understand how to support. We can't but allow the citizens to be the ones at the center of the demand for good governance. And we're seeing it happen, not just in Kenya, it's happened in Nigeria when the End SARS and many other end bad governance has happened. The young people and the women, together with technology, are the game changers for our continent. And we're going to see more and more of that. Thank you.
Merci, Obi. Je vais maintenant...
Thank you, Obi. I'm going to hand it over to Pierre to wrap up our panel discussion. I think we're a little bit late. With 29 seconds over. I'm going to try and be a bit quick. I don't want to conclude, but I want to mention 4 things that strike me in the debate. The first thing is to change the narrative about Africa, change the story. It seems difficult because there's always a negative informational bias. Negative things always hit the headlines. So what we hear in Europe is the things that are going wrong rather than things that are going well. So I think that we need to instead professionalize in order to compensate for this negative narrative. And the good news is that things are changing. The narrative is changing. A lot of investors have a very different perspective on Africa these days. I think the time has come for that this news and this story needs to be told. My second message about the holistic approach that is very necessary. As Karim said, it's difficult to do, but we need to be pragmatic and move forward wherever we can. And in Europe, we have exactly the same problem. We don't know how to take this holistic approach. We tend to have a sequenced approach and a sector-by-sector approach. We are struggling to get hold of complex issues in a holistic manner. And all of the most serious approach on growth, and particularly the commission chaired by Michael Sponson, Nobel Prize winners, say there's no recipe. It has to be a very empirical approach. And this leads me to my third point, to say that everything that's been said on this panel is very similar to the debates that we need to have in Europe. We haven't solved our problems, so we in Europe need to be very modest. And that's where partnerships might take place. There are solutions not just in Europe, but we can learn a lot from approaches that are put in place in other countries, in particular in Africa. And I think this is a key message for Europe. And a final point, perhaps something I disagree with Karim on, not in terms of the content, but in terms of the form. I don't think talking about the end of development aid is very constructive. I think it's about talking about new forms of partnerships that we need, and these partnerships will involve external contributions. There's a subject is how we can use the savings of African people for Africa, but this is an issue that is about the quality of projects that will be built in Africa and the quality of information about it. All of this will require the public to get involved, but that's another discussion that we have to about new forms of public-private partnership in another session. Thank you very much to all of our panelists. It's been excellent. So thank you. After these final comments, thank you to all of you, all of the panelists. Thank you to Pierre, and thank you to all of you for listening to us. Have a very good evening. Thank you.